And to this effect, at the COVID Cabinet Committee meeting this morning and following conversations with the Prime Minister earlier this week and just a few minutes ago, I can announce that Canada will quickly implement the requirement for all arriving passengers to have a negative PCR COVID test 3 days before arriving in Canada.
As you have already heard from my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, Canada is continuing to take strong action to limit the spread of COVID-19 in our country. And to that end, we have implemented some of the strongest border measures in the world. Today, we want to reinforce a very simple but important message. We strongly advise against travel unless it is absolutely necessary. The federal government, and in fact, no government in Canada, can prevent Canadians from traveling. But I want to be very clear. We strongly advise against all discretionary travel. And if you must travel, understand that upon your return to Canada, you must follow guidelines and quarantine for 14 days. It's not just the right thing to do. It's the law. And if you do not follow the requirements, it can result in significant consequences. Let me walk you through that process. First, before you board a flight home to Canada, the airlines are responsible for making sure that all passengers on board their aircraft are not exhibiting symptoms, nor have been exposed to anyone with COVID-19. Travelers who enter Canada by air, land, or marine modes, unless exempted, will also be required to submit information through ArriveCan or by calling the toll-free number during the quarantine or isolation period. When you arrive at the border, you'll be subject to strict screening and security measures. We have significantly increased the presence of CBSA officers at our international airports to ensure that travelers understand their quarantine obligations and to verify their traveler's quarantine plan. Our quarantine requirement is our strongest and most effective measure. It is among the strongest in the world. On the rare occasion that someone brings COVID-19 into Canada, when they are in quarantine, the virus stops there. It does not spread further into the community. And so no matter where you are coming from or where you enter Canada, you will be required to quarantine for 14 days. Your compliance with these requirements will be verified regularly. And if needed, your case can be referred to law enforcement in cases of non-compliance. And let me be very clear. If you violate quarantine, you can face up to 6 months in jail or up to $750,000 in fines. But far more importantly, you will put your family, your friends, and your community at risk. Now, we know that some Canadians have traveled out of the country for non-essential purposes, despite the clear public health guidance asking them not to do so. These Canadians, of course, have a right to return home, but when they come back, they have a responsibility, both legal and moral, to quarantine for 14 days. Unfortunately, it only takes a few people who break quarantine to spread the virus to the community and beyond. We only need to look at the COVID variant recently identified in the United Kingdom, which is now in Canada, to understand why. And that is why we are urging all Canadians to please be responsible, be sensible, and care about your fellow citizens. The rules only protect us if we all follow them. This is an ever-evolving pandemic. I'd like to remind Canadians that restrictions are changing quickly, and they may be imposed by Canada or other countries with little warning as circumstances require. And if you choose to travel, you may be forced to remain outside of Canada longer than you anticipated. For our part, the Government of Canada will take every appropriate measure that we can to protect our citizens at the border. As you have already heard, discussions are underway to further increase enforcement on current measures about greater testing before travel and upon arrival. As Minister LeBlanc advised, the Minister of Transport will be adding a requirement for COVID testing on all flights before entering Canada to further strengthen the robust measures we have already have in place at the border to our 14-day quarantine. I also wish to be very clear. This is not an alternative to quarantine. It's an additional layer of protection. And the measures that are contemplated by the Minister of Transport to require pre-boarding testing and verification of that testing are in addition to the quarantine measures. And so once in place, those measures will enhance our efforts to keep people safe and not offer an alternative to the all-important quarantine period. I'm advised that Minister Garneau, our Minister of Transport, will be engaging with the airline industry on this new requirement, and additional details will be made available by him shortly on how this requirement will be implemented. In addition, discussions are also underway regarding a testing pilot program at the Toronto-Pearson International Airport. This pilot explores how a testing and monitoring program can be used to provide an additional layer of defense against the spread of COVID-19. This follows a testing pilot underway in Alberta. We look forward to sharing more details as these pilots are completed. And as well, work is well underway between the provinces, CBSA, and our public health officials about testing at additional locations. In our discussions with the province, we have heard some desire to use an entry testing regime to reduce the length of mandatory quarantine for travelers. I believe at the current time, we should only be considering testing as an additional measure of a layer of defense against the illness coming into the country.